All right, I think I'm going to go ahead and get started. Again, welcome everyone for joining us. This webinar is Lifestyles for Birds. Before I get started, I'm going to talk about who we are as the Missouri River Bird Observatory. We are the Missouri River Bird Observatory, also known as MRBO. We work to promote conservation of birds through scientific research, population monitoring, policy advocacy, education, and outreach. So a lot of different ways we try and work on bird conservation. Our efforts actually fit into 4 overarching categories depicted in the eggs below. More information can be found on our website, www.mrbo.org. So today it is a all MRBO panel. We'll be running the webinar fully, and the staff that's present today is going to be Paige Whittick, our education coordinator. Dana, who you are all getting emails from and maybe joining for the Q&A section later, is one of the directors and founders of MRBO. And then Ethan Duke is our co-director and co-founder. And then lastly, my name is Zeb Yoko, and I am the conservation science communicator with the organization. So I'm going to go over the outline of our presentation today. But first, I'm also acting as the host, so I'm going to explain the technical notes since we are recording on Zoom. This is a Zoom webinar, so we can't see you as attendees. We do plan on having interaction with our audience, though. So we ask that you type things into the Q&A box if you have questions, and then if you can use the chat if you have technical issues or other concerns. The Q&A is more easier for us to read if you are asking specific questions, though, so we prefer you put questions in there. And these controls are either on the top or the bottom of your screen. I think it varies by computer. But if you hover towards the bottom or the top of the screen, there should be a menu that pops up and you should see those. You may also see a raise hand function. And we may ask you guys to use that today. And then I think there's a couple other settings, but mainly the Q&A session is the one that we want to make sure you are aware of. I'll be adding some resources later to that chat box too, so do keep in mind where that is to find those notes later. Let's see. So I think that's all we have for the webinar tools. Now to the actual outline of what we're going to be talking about. So Ethan is going to lead off actually talking about sourcing sustainable food and particularly growing and foraging. And then I will be back a little bit to talk more about gardening a little bit more, and then also more on the native plant side for the gardening side, and then sustainable living through waste management and plastic and recycling and so on. And then Paige will follow to discuss outdoor wellness and the benefits to you through birding. And then we will all stick around for a question and answer section. And then lastly, I guess I should say too that we intend to run about an hour with the question and answer section. Of course, if there are more questions, we typically do stick around and keep answering questions as they keep coming in. But without any further ado, I am going to pass it over to Ethan.
Thank you, Zeb. Prepared to do a screen share here. Does that work?
Looks good.
Okay. Thank you, everybody. It's kind of a complicated little layout here, but this is pretty exciting stuff. So you saw my notes there. Why give this presentation? Well, we often present about the 7 simple steps of things that you can do to help birds. And we thought we'd just give you some examples of our everyday life actions and things, and that you can really positively affect birds, yourself, and those around you in a variety of ways. And so I'm going to share a little bit about just kind of things in my life, and then hopefully you might have some Q&As about it, but maybe you might come up with a Q&A question. What is that picture on the right? I wonder if anybody really knows what that is. That is actually a horseradish root. It just sort of randomly grows up around near our garden area, and it produces great horseradish. Interesting things around the garden. I'm going to start out with this foraging concept. And everybody knows about morel mushrooms, especially here in Missouri. It used to be on some license plates even. And but I'd like to bring up some of these other mushrooms you might find around that are pretty exciting. I like to use the iNaturals app to help me get in the right neighborhood to identifying mushrooms properly. And I use a host of field guides as well. We do spore prints and a lot of techniques to make sure that we're only harvesting editable mushrooms. There are old mushroom hunters and bold mushroom hunters, but there are no old bold mushroom hunters. So we found some really delicious mushrooms year round. And if you don't have a completely mowed lawn and you have access to other areas where you have some natural areas to go to, you can find mushrooms year round. It's fun to hunt and forage. And then you can create some really wonderful dishes. Like I love doing like mushroom cream sauces and things like that. There's also the idea of hunting and fishing. And I sort of grew up hunting and fishing, so it's always been a very important part of my lifestyle, or important to me as a way of feeding good molecules and good healthy food to my family. And here's a picture on the Missouri River, just catching some catfish. I mean, the Missouri River is loaded with really great catfish, and those were absolutely delicious fish we caught with our friend Dave Erickson. There's me with a monster walleye, and I actually threw that one back because it was so big. I just wanted to stay out there. But the smaller ones I eat every day when I'm catching them. And the hunting aspect is as simple as it is. Hunting licenses are fairly cheap, and I was blessed enough last year to harvest a couple deer in New York. It cost me $100, and I was able to fill the freezers with good quality protein for my family. So it's an important thing, and it's just also a very zen thing to do, to just sit in a tree for a few days as well. Once this whole pandemic thing is over, you might be able to have the opportunity to go fishing someplace, wherever you go on vacation, and you're able to forage on vacation. Try to do it with eco-friendly guides who can teach you or share their knowledge about the local ecology, conservation, and culture. It ends up being really rewarding. Dana and I did an anniversary trip down to Louisiana and did exactly that. It was a trip that we won with the National Wildlife Federation and at their meeting, so it was really a special thing. So back at the home front, Field of Fork, I don't know how many of you grow gardens, but one of the big benefits of it is there's a picture of me on the left after shoveling and digging the third garden bed, and there on the right's another garden bed. And it can be a lot of physical work, whether you're moving around your compost bins or whatnot. It's good, healthy activity. You're not just locked into the news and that kind of thing. So that bed on the left there was tomatoes, and the bed on the right was kale, onions, and purslane, and some volunteer tomatoes this last year, and some peppers just this year. And this is how that little garden, that first one, started coming along. Now that we've been harvesting tomatoes, quite a few of them from there, and then the raccoons ate all my corn. And then you can also raise your own, and I think people get intimidated by this because it might seem like it's too much work, but it's becoming a more popular thing, especially to have chickens, hens, even in suburban areas. And beekeeping is also a really great thing to get into. We ended up, having, just with a few chickens, you can have your egg supply and then some to share. And same with honey. If you get a good beehive going, like we did a couple years ago, you just ended up with plenty of honey to either profit on or share. And it's a really rewarding experience to learn about the bees. I will also say that it's important, if you're going to keep bees, and I also like free ranging chickens, but if you're keeping bees, it's really important to have good pollinator habitat around for them. And you have to consider those types of things when you're making those decisions. As far as, if you're not able to go out there and make your own garden in your property, maybe you know somebody does have some extra acreage, or there's a community garden someplace. Outside of that, still, it's really important to help birds to source locally. I mean, one of the greatest threats is our food system, really, to birds. And so there's a lot of good resources in Missouri, and wherever you live, I'm sure there are plenty of them. Now, I could go on and on and on and on about this aspect, but it's so important to support our local family producers. And it ends up being not as cost prohibitive as you may think, and you get better nutrition. if you're really into this, be sure to tune in September 3rd for our Eating for Birds webinar, which was postponed before, but now it's coming back. And those that are already registered before, you'll be getting an email on that. I guess when it really becomes a fun thing, when you know you've done everything organically and well, and you're taking care of the land right, and you start harvesting these beautiful vegetables, then it comes to the joy of cooking. And there's something added special thing about cooking with your own vegetables and the things that you grew, like that big, beautiful tomato right there. And part of that is this whole thing of preparation. And like that photo in the middle there, I just sliced our tomatoes, then I diced up some basil and some other herbs and sprinkled them over the tomatoes, and I stuck them in a dehydrator. And I had a great base for making sauces and things that I could just sort of kind of puree up and start it right out with a paste. And they're just, you could eat them just like chips as well. Dana enjoys it as well. There she is, enjoying it. And part of that preparation that we get into is also understanding how to preserve your food. And I'd recommend this book on charcuterie, which is this ancient art. I mean, we've been preserving meat forever, and it really hasn't changed much. It's really simple, but it's fun and delicious, and you can make things to your taste. Now, there's Dana not enjoying preparing casings for sausage making, but when we end up getting something and putting our own good ingredients in there, we end up getting something pretty nice in the end. Another advantage about this kind of idea of foraging and going to farmers markets and getting your food in these sustainable and enjoyable ways is we don't have that right there. That is, what is that disgusting stuff? It's like plastic with stuff in it that's not good for you. It's like you're paying money to harm our environment for that and to harm your bodies. So it's just nice to really embrace the healthier alternatives to plastics and packaging and all that. Here's our glass jars that we have our spices in. I got a pile of chipotle and cayenne and dill and basil and rosemary. And once you start accumulating more, you have your own sort of bulk section right there, and it just looks nicer as well as being healthier. So those are the few things that I had to throw in and share about how we love to live from the field and do so in a bird friendly manner. And I think I'll head it over to Zeb now.
All right. Yeah, so I'm going to share my screen again, and I should be picking up basically right where he left off, where Ethan left off, because I'm going to be talking about the issues with plastic. So one of the things that you can really do to be sustainable and help birds is by reducing your plastic and other single-use consumption items. And the main tenets of this are going to be, of course, reduce, reuse, and recycle. Ethan left off with that great point about the damage of plastic waste too. So there's a lot of different things we can do to go forward to help manage that, including growing your own food and preserving it in your own home. So one of the first things I think is pretty intuitive also is using reusable items instead when at all possible. I think the easiest way to cut down on waste is bringing and using your own reusable mugs and water bottles as pictured here. This is part of my personal stash of water bottles and coffee mugs. They may require you to fill at home before you leave now, which is probably safer anyway than using like a shared water fountain, and much less wasteful than the little single-use disposable plastic water bottles. If possible, I try to use from my now extensive collection of reusable bags too, but that isn't always the case anymore with everything going on. They don't want you to bring in your own reusable ones. One thing you can do at least is request paper bags over plastics because those are more sustainable. You can also repurpose single-use items like these wine bottles pictured here. I will make a note that this is not my project. It was one that I found online. It was a list of 40 things you can do to upcycle. I do have some of my own planters that are reused single-use items, and I've got quite a weird collection, and I'm looking forward to using more next year as well. But those are one of the other things you can do with single-use items is find another use for them. Or if nothing else, try and recycle them. Now this is a challenge sometimes because plastic is hard to recycle. And one of the reasons that we do need to change our use on single-use items is that plastic production is getting more and more, there's just more and more buildup because the plastic production doubles every couple of years, every 15 years, and it takes hundreds of years for it to decompose. And decompose is kind of a misnomer. Plastic generally just breaks into smaller and smaller parts. We, as an organization, earlier this spring were able to host a screening of the story of plastic where we learned much more about this issue. One of the takeaways was that plastic is growing in usage and production, and of course litter, because very little is recycled. So plastic pollution, though, was another point that the story of plastic brought up, was that plastic pollution is not totally the fault of consumers either. A lot of the issues go further up the corporate chain, and these links here from Story of Plastic and breakfreefromplastic.org, I will put in the chat, go over these issues a lot and tell you how you can help with solutions. And hint, one of the major actions is contacting representatives and of course voting, and making sure that people know that we want to help reduce the impacts of plastic going forward in the future. Okay, so that was a little bit of the dark and depressing side of things, but things that I try and do to help prevent those issues. The next one is much more lively, I think, and that's native plants and how native plants help with multiple ecological issues. Like in the last one where we're trying to talk about conserving and preserving the environment, native plants sequester carbon. They sequester carbon in the soil in their extensive root systems that are much more extensive than the typical ornamental plants that you may also have in your area. So I'm talking again about gardening, so on your like personal lawn level, more so than doing a full-scale habitat restoration. This is something that you can do in your personal home or your personal garden area. And actually, you can put native plants in your upcycled, reusable, or single-use containers. And I have every intention of doing that in the future with mine soon. So yeah, native plants sequester tons of carbon in the soil, and they do take some patience to establish, but generally they are easy to sustain once they get established, or easier to sustain, and they provide environmental benefits in that regard. And they also are host to many insects and pollinators, which I will get to in just a second as well. So native plants are beautiful additions to any garden. And I said any garden, any lawn, landscape, any planter boxes, there are lots of options for those as well that you can put them in. I mean, these beautiful flowers would belong in any yard, right? Look at these things. In full disclosure, these photos are taken out in their wild habitat. And then I want to make a note to only take photos from the wild habitat. Don't be trying to collect wildflowers. I haven't gotten a chance to plant any on my landscape yet because I just purchased my home earlier this year. And with all the stuff going on, it's really hard to get that going on right now. But I've been doing the planning phase, and actually I'm really gonna kind of try and crank it up here soon because a lot of native plants you want to try and establish in the fall. So I plan to put some of these plants in my yard in the future, but right now I just wanted to highlight how beautiful they are and the wonderful ecological impacts they have if you want to do the same. As I mentioned earlier, native plants are, they host native bugs that, yes, are of course good for birds. You can see here that they attract insects. They have pollinators and other things that will eat the plants, which can also be beneficial if you follow Ethan's tips to grow your own food, that the bugs may prefer these native plants and not harm many of your produce crops quite as much. Hopefully, that's the hope. Regardless, they do bring bugs into your area, and then those are good food for birds. And again, healthy ecosystems are wonderful and beneficial to everything. Okay, and then, so I did mention that natives take some patience to establish, and particularly to find is one of the challenges for finding native plants to bring into your area. But fortunately, there are lots of research going on and resources on how to grow natives in your area. And then I wanted to highlight too that the research shows that even small scale restoration, you landscaping or putting native plants in your yard, does a really good job of helping the environment and helping birds. So I've got a couple of resources here that are from these screenshots that I pulled away, and then I'll put in the chat as well. So I'll be bombarding the chat probably during the Q&A, not so much during Paige's talk, so you guys can focus on her part. And I'm going to leave it to Paige right now, and she's going to cover the benefits of nature in your life, helping your wellness. And I think you can see here too that personally, I can corroborate that being in nature does help your personal wellness.
Yes, we're always smiling in our photos. How many of you noticed the bugs on that one picture that Zeb showed before he circled them? Because I definitely didn't notice them the first time I saw that photo, but I thought it was interesting. So back to birds, everybody. My favorite, because birds are awesome. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the benefits of birding and getting outside and seeing these different birds. So let's get started. So first, let's talk about how bird watching is much more common than I think it appears at first from the outside. So a study done, or a report done by the US Fish and Wildlife Service in 2011, so it's kind of dated. We need a new report, but this is the most recent information I could find. They found that there were 47 million bird watchers 16 years of age and older in the US, which is about 20% of the population. So that's a lot of people that are out there watching birds. And another part of that statistic that I thought was really interesting was that backyard birding, or watching birds around your home, is the most common form of bird watching, making up about 88% of those birders that were surveyed that said they identified as birders. So it's definitely something you can do from your own backyard. And it turns out that's the most popular way to do so, and a great way to get started doing it if you aren't already. But I believe a lot of the people on here today are in our bird nerd group already, but still, we're not alone. But another part of this report that I want to point out was that they also found that 93% of American birders identified as white. So birders are, in short, not a racially or ethnically diverse group. And the reasons for this disparity need to be addressed, and they need to be fixed. And so that's why it's so important for us to support different efforts like Black Birders Week that provide a safe and welcoming forum for bird lovers who have been excluded or feel unwelcome elsewhere. And we as a society, as an organization, and as individuals need to be dedicated to working towards equity, diversity, and inclusion and justice in our birding community. And here at MRBO, we're going to be talking more about this topic at an upcoming webinar, Environmental Justice for People and Birds. So you can register for that. That's on September 1st. And I hope you guys will tune in. So the outdoors belong to everyone, and everyone deserves the benefits that being outdoors provides, which we're going to talk about which I'm going to talk about in this webinar. So, but first, before we get to those benefits, I want to bring up another interesting news that I found in researching for this presentation. So during the devastating COVID-19 pandemic, they've noticed, some app developers have noticed that the apps for bird identification and different bird related apps the downloads of them have gone up. So the National Audubon Society reports that downloads for their free bird identification app in March and April doubled over that same period last year. And that Cornell Lab of Ornithology's free bird ID app, Merlin ID, saw downloads shoot up 120% over the same time last year, with 8,500 downloads over Easter weekend alone, which is a lot. This is so awesome. And that they've also seen visits to their live bird cams have doubled, and that uploads of bird photos and calls have increased 45 and 84% respectively on Ebird. So, and I'll talk more about Ebird later, but so we've seen a huge, what this tells me is that we've seen an interest in learning more about birds. And it's no wonder, because bird watching is something that you can do from your home or around the neighborhood. You can do it by opening up a window and listening to the birds outside. Sometimes you don't even have to open your window to hear those really loud birds. It is pretty simple. You just need to use your ears and your eyes, and it can be really inexpensive. So you can kind of choose how much money you want to invest in it. But like I said, it's can be as simple as walking outside and using different resources to try to figure out what that bird is. And it's ideal for any mobility level. So you can do it from sitting in a chair watching out your window, or you can go on a long hike and find a variety of different birds in different habitats. It also promotes getting outdoors and exercising. I know when I was first learning to bird, I was like, perfect, an activity that is a great excuse for me to go outside on a walk and have my brain be active and my body and be active as well. It's cognitively stimulating. So like I talked about, when you're out there trying to figure out what bird is which, it definitely is a mental challenge sometimes, and it can be really exciting. But I'd like to say that even though it can be a challenge, it definitely is not stress inducing, at least for me. Birding relieves stress and soothes anxiety in a variety of different ways. And we'll kind of go into that more later as well. And another great thing about bird watching is that you can contribute to conservation and science. And that's what I'm going to talk about a little bit more when we're talking about Ebird. So if you're unfamiliar, this is a community science project that is run by the Cornell Lab of Ornithology. And it's both a website and an app that you can use on your phone. And it does a lot of different things. But it's one of the largest biodiversity projects in the world. And people download checklists of different birds that they're seeing in their neighborhoods all around the world, and it gets put in this huge database, and Cornell Lab uses that to learn more about birds and learn better ways and better strategies to conserve those birds. But Ebird is not just great for like that science research-based reason, it's also like really fun and great for you to use. So you can find more birds, so you can use their website to go on and be like, I really want to see this specific species of bird. You can look at where people have seen that more recently, all around the world really, but I mostly use it for Missouri. And you can keep track of your bird list, photos, and sounds. So I like it as a way to keep track of, oh, have I seen that before? When did I see it? If you have photos, you can put that in there and it'll keep track of all of that stuff for you, which is really, really helpful and fun because it's kind of like a game. You want to collect them all. And like I said, you can explore the latest sightings from around the world, and you can contribute to science and conservation. So there's really a lot of benefits, and we could do a whole presentation on Ebird and all the cool stuff that it does, and maybe we will one day, but I'm sure Ebird also has a lot of presentations about what their website and app can do on their website. So, birding feeds the brain. And like we've kind of been saying, if you're a new birder, just identifying the birds you can see can be a challenging mental puzzle. And if you're an experienced birder, I know every time I go out, I learn new things every day about the behavior and ecology of our local birds. I never stop learning about birds. And studies have shown that these kinds of mental exercises, so looking at a bird and trying to figure out what it is, sometimes it's easy and sometimes it's not so easy, but doing that type of mental exercise, that mental puzzle, can help form neural paths that can help fight back against Alzheimer's, other kinds of dementia, and Parkinson's. And so I think that's really, really interesting. And I'm sure that there are studies that are looking into that further. So talking about some of the other research that's done that shows that birding and other types of outdoor exercises benefits our mental health. So according to research by academics at the University of Exeter, the British Trust for Ornithology, and the University of Queensland, people living in neighborhoods with more birds, shrubs, and trees are less likely to suffer from depression, anxiety, and stress. I think that's super significant. And I think that for a lot of us, it's probably not that surprising, but there now is research to back up this thing that we've all been feeling, I think, when we're outside in nature. Another study in England found that urban green spaces reduced residents' sense of isolation and loneliness. And another study showed that living a short walk from a park in Los Angeles seemed to offer the same mental health boost, as there was a 2-point decrease in unemployment. In Spain, school children raised in greener neighborhoods had more neural connections and brain regions tied to working memory and attention. That is so fascinating. This research is just beginning, but it's really exciting, and more investigations are going into questions that doctors, therapists, educators, public health experts, you and me, conservationists, are all really interested in understanding more about what it is about these things that really can help us, our mental health, our physical health, all that stuff. And University of Washington environmental psychologist Gary Bratman stated that the evidence is there to support the conclusion that contact with nature benefits our mood, our psychological well-being, our mental health, and our cognitive functioning. Sorry guys, I'm having trouble speaking tonight, but it's just so exciting. So birding, yeah, it's great for your mental health. And when we're talking about lifestyles with birds, I think of it as practice in mindfulness. And I think a lot of people would define mindfulness in different ways. But one way that I look at it is maintaining a moment-by-moment awareness of our thoughts, feelings, bodily sensations, and surrounding environment through a gentle, nurturing lens. And I think that birds sometimes, most of the time for me, are that gentle, nurturing lens. The birds teach you to notice the little details around you. It opens up a whole new world. You'll start noticing things that when I'm walking in a group, they're like, how did you even notice that? And it's like the birds taught me because I'm looking for that little movement at the top of the tree to find that warbler. And it teaches you to notice those differences. I want to tell you guys of the story about when I first took my dad birding for the first time. So we went in a place that we have gone a lot of times before. It's one of those parks that you go when you're just like, let's go out in nature, and you go to this park, and it's a place where schools take class field trips and things like that. And I'd never been birding before there either. But at the end of the day, my dad was like, I've never realized in this place that I've been so many times, the different birds that were around me the whole time that I've been there before, but I never would have noticed. And so learning your birds really teaches you and shows you this whole other world that was there the whole time. And you're like, what other things may I not have noticed? And it really brings you into that present moment. So with this presentation, I hope that we wrapped up this, or showed you guys kind of how birds and a love for birds can really be tied into, and wanting to conserve birds can really be tied into all different aspects of your life. So with that concludes my presentation. So yeah, birds are awesome, and lifestyles with birds are awesome too.
Hey, Paige, while you're talking, was that actually a bird singing through your window? I heard bird song coming from someplace.
Possibly. There's a bird. I'm right in front of a window that has a window bird feeder on it. So it's quite possible.
I also heard it. Yeah, I think that definitely.
Yay!
I was like, that wasn't some sort of plant that you just sort of put in there, or had somebody playing the song in the background or something for ambiance. That was really
there's
a thing.
like a whole family of house finches out there.
Cool.
That's awesome. All right, so
Yeah.
I'm going to start bombarding the chat while we start answering any questions you guys have. So we don't have too many right now, but if you guys have any questions like Ask a Birder or any other questions about our presentation, feel free to chime in the Q&A section. So the first question we did have was somebody missed us last week, and they look forward to seeing us on their afternoons when we have our weekly webinars. So I guess it's kind of a comment, but if anybody wants to fill in on that, go ahead. I'm going to keep typing in the chat.
Yeah, that's great. I mean, it's wonderful that, you know, we enjoy putting these together, and it's wonderful to give people a break from whatever the regular grind is, and hopefully it's a new and different window and new and different information and things that you know help improve your life every time you jump on. I enjoy it. I enjoy hearing from my colleagues and what you guys come up with. Paige, that was really neat stuff, and it made me think of a presentation that the director for the Missouri Department of Conservation gave at a community group event, and she had all sorts of research about things like suburban areas and urban areas where just a difference in a few trees in the neighborhood around people's houses drastically increased their outlook on life and how they felt about things. I mean, they have real good scientific metrics behind how nature benefits people. And then we all attended that presentation somewhat recently for climate leadership training. And we saw that, spending a lot of time indoors, not only is it just bad to have a bunch of screen time, but also carbon dioxide levels and things are directly linked to cognitive ability and performance. And so these things are real, and it's so nice to have such a great alternative as nature whenever you can find it. And they say that there's within half an hour of any place you live in Missouri, there's a natural area or a conservation area or state park or something that you can go to just to get away. And I encourage everybody to take advantage. There's always some place to go. And wherever you live, you can find something nearby.
Yeah, excellent. I think I'm gonna
Paige, you said something yesterday, and I'm not sure if you said it tonight or not, but you said something wonderful about how even if it takes some work to do things like reduce plastics or to purchase in a certain way or to go out of your way to go to a farmer's market or to a local producer, even though it takes a little bit more effort to do that, especially at first, you mentioned that you are actually way less stressed because you're actually like taking some action. And I don't know if you said that tonight or not, but when you said it yesterday, I thought that was a really excellent and positive way to think about it.
Yeah. I don't think I did mention it because it didn't like flow within what I was talking about. It would have been kind of random for me to talk about plastics, but well, I don't know. But yeah, like I think there was a long time when I think before, like kind of in college, where I knew about all these issues, but it just felt like trying to reduce my plastic was something I couldn't afford, and I didn't have time to look into how to get sustainable food. And then now with like kind of my journey towards that, it's like, whoa, I'm like I'm actually less stressed. It's actually a lot less stress for me to do these beneficial things because I can look at that thing that I'm doing and it's something that's like bird-friendly coffee is something I have every day that I can look at and be like, oh, this is a good thing I'm doing. And I don't have to look at all the plastic in my life and just be like, oh my gosh, what am I doing to the planet? So like for me personally, it's a lot less stressful to take those actions. Yeah, and I'm gonna add an article that I read that was put out by Audubon magazine about mental health and birding that has a lot of great like other more information and resources in it. So I'm gonna add that to the chat as well because it looks like Zeb added a ton of great info for you guys.
Yeah, Zeb had some great points there about those plastics because we've been duped into thinking that it's all our fault, but really the fault of the plastics relies on the production end, which he pointed out really well. But sometimes we've used that as an excuse to be like, well, since it's not really our fault, maybe we shouldn't adjust. But no, we can do everything. Paige used to harp at me. What did she say? Reduce, reuse, recycle. But reduce first.
Yeah, that's exactly right. All right, so I'm 2 questions quick. One was, where do we find these resources you mentioned? They should be in the chat function on the webinar. And then I'll also put them up. I didn't mention it earlier that we are recording this webinar and it'll be on our website under that same page that didn't hyperlink. The MRBO webinars page will have this one when it goes up. And then on each webinar's details, I put all the links that we discuss. So that's where you can find those. So that answers that one. And then back to reduce, reuse, recycle. One other aspect of it that Ethan mentioned in our practice yesterday, Ethan mentioned it, but we didn't go over it yet today. This is a question from Teresa. Are brown paper bags added to compost, yes or no? So I know Ethan had mentioned something about potentially talking about compost, and I don't know the answer to that question, so I will leave it to him and anybody else on our panel.
I don't know the answer.
I don't either.
So
it's a great question.
So my understanding is that, which we compost here, and we've gone through a lot of, gosh, so you can find things like compostable wine cups that look like plastic, they act like plastic. Bear with me, I'm going somewhere with this. Coffee pods, things like that. In our experience, those things will eventually break down and are definitely better than plastic that won't ever. But those are a lot more difficult. My understanding, although I don't believe that we've tried to compost a paper bag, East can correct me if I'm wrong, he's more of the composter. I think that there are concerns about the chemical processes by which they are made, and so they don't necessarily always break down.
Yeah, I would think that some that may be made with a lot of some other chemicals you might have to worry about, but according to like some organic websites I was looking at, people do recycle or compost their brown bags. Composting is a really fun and enjoyable art, and we use brown paper bags, but we recycle them by reusing them most often, and then we'll often take them into recycling, because the way we compost, we do all of our kitchen scraps and all that stuff that's not meat, goes into it, and so that creates what we end up with is a lot of browns actually. And so the challenge is you want to have a balance between your browns and your greens going in there. So I'm not always looking for anything brown to throw in there. But it's a neat idea, and I'm going to look around and Google around a little bit more. The first couple of things they came up with said, yeah, definitely you can do it. But I would just be wary of where they came from. I had an entomology professor back in the day who did an experiment and with caterpillars, and he had 2 tanks, and one of the tank's caterpillars died and the other ones reproduced successfully. And man, those entomologists in the lab, they were just beating their heads against the wall, trying to figure out what happened. And what they found out is the newspaper that they used to line the cages with, it was all shredded up newspaper. And what they found out is it came from 2 different sources. And one came from like the New York Times, which is made out of pulp paper out of Canada. And they happen to use a lot of insecticides in that area. And the other ones came from pulps that didn't get exposed to pesticides. So you never know what's really in your clean paper products.
I've seen, we got one in the chat and one in the Q&A box that did say that you can compost them, kind of echoing what you guys said. Specifically, be considerate of what glues and composition they have on them, glues and ink, and then tear them into strips so they don't form mats. That's part of it. What else? I was going to say something else.
We're always looking to source, like a printing and things like that using soy-based or just, more natural products and producing more organic papers. I mean, that's a whole nother thing, but I think just a few businesses make that leap. It makes a big impact.
Okay, and one more point about paper bags. So somebody wanted to discuss if they are actually better than plastic bags because they use trees. Is that a concern? Are they better or not? If anybody wants to jump in, feel free.
Can I just say,
go ahead, Paige. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, well, what I like about this question is that they're thinking about sourcing. So not only like the thing itself and where it ends up, but also like where it's coming from. And so I guess my comment on it is just, yeah, paper bags with the trees, but also plastic. And one thing that you learn with the story of plastic too, is that plastic also comes from this really tragic process up the line, even before it becomes pollution. And so there's a lot of not so great stuff before it's actually a plastic bag as well. But I'll let you guys comment further on what you think about that.
That is an excellent point, Paige.
Well, yeah, I agree. And I didn't think of it in that context in that way. only answer that popped into my pea brain was, you know, I think Dana had a lot of experience in the Olympic Mountains, Washington, during her master's work on hairy woodpeckers. And she worked on a project that was really looking at silviculture, really looking at forestry, looking at, you know, microbial or fungal life, to nesting success and all sorts of interrelated things. And when you're in those environments, like I was in Tennessee with cerulean warblers, you really learn that these foresters nowadays, especially some of the great ones in Missouri, are really focused on these sustainable harvest practices. And there's a gradient of those being more or less sustainable. But in our neck of the woods, I mean, I can't speak for all of, say, Oregon or some of the western areas where they have these magnificent large trees. But here, those are sustainable practices, and they sort of mimic kind of the natural processes of a shifting mosaic. And it's more like a gardening with trees than a damaging process.
I will agree and echo that point. Actually, the last conference we went to in person, the Natural Resource Conference, there were some of the foresters there. They were talking about they actually need pulp. They need a demand for the product because it is part of sustainable forestry management, is sometimes logging and removing trees, and finding a product for it is part of the actual sustainable, healthy way to manage a forest. So yes,
So
there are
all
issues
that
with it,
being
but yes.
all that's being said, though, so that is all completely true. I agree with that, both in Missouri and in places that I've worked as well. The intent is certainly sustainable forestry, right? Because if you're, I mean, just even for a simple economic factor, if you're a paper company or you're a sawmill, you know, making construction products or whatever, you don't want to completely deplete your supply, which is really eventually what you would do and what was done in the early part of the last century. But that being said, I don't find it to be a good lifestyle for birds to have a forest become a paper bag. It's not a necessary item. Now, you know, housing, I mean, for people, pretty necessary item, you know? So if I'm at the store, well, during COVID, when there's safety concerns about bringing people's own bags, which is, from all the science that we've read about it, is quite honestly pretty ridiculous at this point. I would always choose paper, though, instead of plastic, if my only options were one of those two things. So just another kind of perspective.
Yeah, I like that. And talking about like reduce, reuse, recycle, and reduce, then reuse, like paper bags are easier to reuse.
Yeah.
Well, I maybe shouldn't have said that. There's some people have found ways to reuse plastic bags. But I think what we all would say, well, we don't want to have to choose. We want to use reusable bags. That's the best option. So.
Perfect. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, so we did have one more follow-up comment to this discussion. Teresa did find out that her grocery store will let them start bringing their own bags in, but they need to bag their own purchases, which is totally fine. So it's worth asking. So as things have developed, as the research has developed, now it's worth asking again, hey, is this okay? I'll do it myself, I promise. You know, like, there are ways to go about this now that we do know a little bit more about the situation.
Zeb, I just want to make a super brief comment on that. So I can totally understand, and you know, many people that are in the audience tonight know that we, MRBO, have been like super careful about COVID. We're taking it very seriously. So I don't mean to downplay any sort of potential like infection possibilities. The thing that gave me pause, though, was that immediately some of the research about contaminated surfaces came out towards the beginning of the pandemic, and it was found that particles of COVID stayed on plastic actually longer than other things. And nonetheless, the immediate push by industry was, hey, everybody, you totally have to, you know, stop using any kind of reusable bags in stores. And if restaurants open again, they all have to use disposable plastic knives and forks because it's really unsafe. And again, not to downplay the fact that people have gotten coronavirus from, you know, contaminated surfaces, but the push for not using everyone's own reusable bags was not really based on science. It was based on profit.
Yep. Okay. So I don't see any more questions coming in unless anybody has any final comments. I think we should probably go ahead and wrap it up.
Thanks so much, everybody. Hopefully we'll see you next week, and you'll get emails about upcoming webinars. And we had one rescheduled that Ethan mentioned, so hope to see you there.
Thanks,
Yep.
guys. Bye, everybody.
All right. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks.